Hello, everyone. Here Ulysses Levaroni for Cyclical Dreams, and I have the pleasure to be with Robert Rich. Yes, Robert Rich is with us, and it's a pleasure that you share your musicianship, your knowledge with us, and well, we want to say welcome. Uh, Hello, Robert.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation.
Well, first of all, we would like to know about your musical origins. It's like how everything starts inside you about music. How the interest start. Can you tell us about?
Well, of course, we all grow up with the music that our parents or grandparents listened to, which in my case was jazz. My father played jazz. He was an engineer, but he played jazz guitar and mostly a West Coast cool school kind of thing in the 1950s. And I grew up with my grandfather in the Midwest, who was a doctor, and he loved big band jazz. And he had, in the 1960s, a early hi-fi system with stereo speakers and a reel-to-reel tape deck, and he would take 78 RPM jazz discs and copy them to his Sony reel-to-reel. And so I remember growing up with the sound of Louis Armstrong and Count Basie and Benny Goodman and things like that, and then also Stan Getz and Miles Davis and stuff. So the beginnings of my own musical language probably came more from rejecting that and trying to find a language of sound that I would hear all around me. I really found myself attracted to environment and to the sounds of rain and frogs and birds, which sounds like a cliche, but really it was a way of discovering how ears can take us out of our body into space. We can hear around walls, whereas we cannot see around walls. And that discovery that I could lay in bed with the windows open in my bedroom and actually take my mind outside the windows and travel into the world of sound like an out-of-body experience shaped how I heard sound and how I wanted to present sound. And of course, I was growing up during the 1970s when psychedelic music and progressive rock and the German electronic music scene was happening, and those things were very influential. Later, I started finding that my interest in the sequencer sound that the Germans were making was becoming less strong. I was actually getting tired of it and started discovering some of the music that those people were influenced by, in particular Terry Riley, and music like Rainbow and Curved Air and In C. And in 1980, he put out an album that really, really affected me, which was called Shri Camel. And the difference was that Terry's music was all played live by hand. And it had this repetitive, quickly moving, trance-like quality, but it was living. It was more like Indian music in some ways. And I actually found myself much more attracted to that organic sound, the sound of a human playing. And I think that's where my own style diverged from the more common sound of the sequencers and things, because I was trying to find a language that was more organic.
And did you
I
try
was
playing like these minimalism structures?
Yes, it sort of went between that and almost a freeform jazz like Keith Jarrett or something like that. Um, and you can hear bits of those influences later. Even early on, when I was a better keyboardist, I could actually play some of those styles a little better. And there's live concert recordings you can find on YouTube from the 1990s and before, where I'm playing quite a bit more quickly, more densely. I had a big hand injury in 2005, and that hurt my ability to perform that style of music by hand. So now I do rely more on machines than I used to. um, but I think really for me, the musical language had nothing to do with the instruments themselves. It wasn't about synthesizers. It wasn't about this kind of fetish with gear that people have so much these days. I think, especially with the explosion of Euro rack modular synths, you've just got people who are basically gear fetish addicts. And I felt that you could do the same thing with any instrument if you wanted to take it into a place where the music was conscious, where the music was about listening deeply into the space between the notes, or the space between your ears, perhaps. It was really music about mind and music about traveling within your imagination and within your own thoughts. So in this sense, I think that it shares much more in common with trance music around the world, Indonesian gamelan or Indian classical music or African drumming, all of the things that influenced minimalists in the 60s, traditions that have been common throughout human history, these shamanic traditions of how to use sound to create a sort of altered state of consciousness. And I think that you can use any instrument. So I've been always studying how to find the vocabulary of trance within all of the possibilities that we have.
So this is pretty nice. I agree deeply with your vision. I think music it's inside us. We can do it with many instruments, not with the some fashion instruments that became in some moments in the ages. But um, I think minimalism is an excellent example of that. There, there were in mankind for 1,000 years repetition and structure and shifting structures and all the things that happen. So this is very a beautiful vision. And do you think that you have a kind of evolution in those ideas from maybe a kind of drone like, because you use several instruments anyway, or maybe several groups of things. So in one hand you have your lap guitar or those very long stringed instruments that you are looking for a kind of voice or a kind of weird overtones. Also, I saw you playing a kind of, I must say, Glissando's guitar using a gong-like reference. That
Yes, definitely.
you know, remembering David Allen investigations on guitar that I suppose that he took from Sid Barrett. I don't.
No, actually, David got there first, for sure. In
Maybe,
fact,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, because remember that Soft Machine and Pink Floyd and Jimi Hendrix toured together with in England in 1966, and David was doing that back in 1963 with Terry Riley. They invented tape loops as well, if you remember.
Yes, that's true.
Terry and David were hanging around in 1963 in Paris, selling newspapers and making tape loops. I had the pleasure of spending an evening with David at his house in Byron Bay, Australia, in 2012 when I was out there for a month for concerts, and I was able to thank him. I said, basically, I have been using glissando guitar as a main voice to create a vocal sound for years now, and he was familiar with my music a bit, and he just very graciously said, "Oh, we are brothers in the Gliss," So he's wonderful, and I miss him. He was
Yes,
a
he
big,
was
big influence.
a great man. Yes,
Yeah,
an
just a
incredible.
wonderful spirit.
Yes,
Uh,
and a very personal music, and I think inspired us a lot. I use a kind of Glissandos guitar for almost 30 years in my life, because I saw David doing that. I say, oh, that's magic, and I never heard something about something like. So well, we agree again with the Gliss brotherhood. So this is a kind of voice that is completely different from synthesizers world. There's a lot of errors and little details, and in the texture of the metal there's a lot of information. I
Yes.
remember myself doing with a stone with a metal to have some texture in the metal piece for get more overtones. So this is one hand, and in the other hand you have all the sequencer world. So how do you feel this make their evolution in your career? It's like you always work with all these elements, or you go with ones or the other by, I don't know.
Each project has its own source of inspiration, and oftentimes I'll choose a language and narrow my choices into one area in order to focus. It's not so much that there's a lot of evolution, although certainly I've gotten better at certain things, and I've probably gotten worse at certain things over the years. Certainly my equipment has gotten better, but I've gotten bored with certain things too. In the early days, I had very primitive equipment. I had no multi-track tape, so everything was recorded live, or I would record something to cassette and play two cassettes at the same time while I was playing something else and mix it all down to stereo it live.
Okay.
And so the limitations had to do with equipment. I didn't have a good sequencer. I had home built modular synth Paya stuff that was horrible, wouldn't stay in tune. And I had a 12-step sequencer with that, but I couldn't use it for ostinato parts because it sounded horrible. It was not tunable, really. I mean, some of the stages were unstable. So if I wanted to do something that sounded, like a German sequencer part like Klaus Schulze or something, I needed to do it with arpeggios. And I had modified the keyboard scanner on the Paya keyboard so that I could hold down notes and it would scan up the notes by breaking the clock up. It was all handmade stuff. And so instead of playing repeating sequencer parts, I could do these arpeggio things and use echoes to try to create something complex. But it was very primitive, and so I only did it once or twice. The opening of the live concert Inner Landscapes in 1984 had a sequencer part like that, and a few other times, but I generally avoided it because they were already doing it so much better than I could do it with the Moog sequencers. These guys had much more money. I was still in high school when I started. I was 16, and the money I had was enough to build an oscillator every month or something. So that was the first limitation. And so I tried to find a voice that I could, actually make an album with. And that was with Gliss guitar or flutes, or, I had my modular that I could only make insect sounds with, or drones. And I had a used Prophet 5 that was a Rev 1 that some friends of mine at Sequential were able to get for me cheaply. And that was my main instrument. So, I would do things that sounded like Tibetan chant or like layers of flute because that was all I had. As time progressed and I was able to get a multi-track, I was able to go more complex. And the first album I did like that was Numina, which came out in Sweden in 1987. But those recordings were in 1985 mostly. And that was the first time I could do anything really more complex. It was still using an arpeggiator though. So, the evolution was really not so much in the very beginning, the first 10 years or so, it was somewhat an evolution of equipment, but it was also an evolution of skills. And then it became more a question of pursuing different philosophical questions with each album, different puzzles I would set for myself. Questions about architecture grew into the album Gaudi. Questions about biology grew into the album Propagation. Questions about Sufism and alchemy grew into the album Seven Veils. So each of these albums, has a series of philosophical pursuits behind it, or a series of questions.
So you take other part of life. I mean, as a source of inspiration, as a guide for different compositions.
Absolutely. It's the way that I use to stay inspired with new ideas. I don't really know how to inspire myself with just musical ideas on their own. I need to find some philosophical push. So like an album like Bestiary was an answer to the surrealist André Breton's hatred of music. He distrusted music because he thought that it was incapable of making a concrete idea. It was only capable of abstraction, he said. And so I thought that, well, he had never heard what we can do with musique concrète and with electronics. So to me, Bestiary was an attempt to make a sort of sonic version of an Yves Tanguy painting, sonic surrealism in the literal sense, an abstraction that was fully concrete and that felt like it could walk out of the speakers and crawl across the room, So each of these things becomes a puzzle. Temple of the Invisible was searching into the ideas of ancient musical ritual, shall we say. And I wanted to create a fictitious culture that might have existed perhaps 1,000 years ago, perhaps in the Hindu Kush or somewhere in the Himalayas, maybe creating a ritual in a cave. And it was actually sort of, there's a libretto in my mind of a sort of...
You need to create a movie to put the music.
Absolutely. And that album, I wanted to create something entirely acoustic with no electronics at all. And imagining something that could have been made 1,000 years ago. So each of these albums will have a set of questions and a set of puzzles or challenges that I set myself.
So you take this source of inspiration that I think that there are things that come into your mind and you are being interested with different subjects. But when you compose the music, do you work with a kind of method, or you just improvise and organize this improvisation, or how is it, or is different because all the ideas shoots different methods in each composition, in each work? How it is?
It is a little different with each project based upon the questions that each project has. Although usually I do start with improvisation. There's a few answers to this. I mean, to be the most simplistic, I would say I usually use a kind of splat technique, which is to say, throwing something against the wall and seeing what shape it takes, and then editing it until it takes the shape that I imagine it could have. Usually it starts with random acts in the studio, just trying things, experimenting, moving microphones around to record sounds, or setting, taking recordings from environments and putting them in a timeline and then filling them in. Or, sometimes just playing some piano and recording it and then half speeding it, or maybe, like when Ian Boddy showed up at my studio for the first time when we were recording Outpost, without telling him before I got there, I put rubber erasers in my piano strings to prepare it, like John Cage. And the first thing I did to get us started was I had microphones there, and I said to Ian, "Look, I've prepared the piano. Let's do some prepared piano." And so that started the album. It basically kicked us into gear. And we start with some ideas. We start with a story. There's another answer to that, though, which is that if you don't have some filter to decide what accidents to keep and what accidents to throw away, then it's hard to know how to work forward. And for that, I struggle sometimes. And I use a technique which I think about a story, considering that you're from Buenos Aires, a story by Jorge Luis Borges, one of my favorite stories of his, which is The Circular Ruins.
Oof.
And he is one of my favorite writers of all times. And The Circular Ruins, for those who don't know it, is about a magician who dreams his own successor. and he goes into the forest and he sleeps until this human starts forming in his dreams. And at the end, there's a huge fire and it burns down the forest and the person runs away. The next shaman, the next magician who has been dreamt into reality. I think of the circular ruins as a metaphor for art, for creation in general, in that we come up with something solid out of nothing. There is an act of creation which is dreaming the possible. And another story that I think is a similar metaphor is the ancient Hebrew story of the golem, which, the idea is that a rabbi, in an act of ego, an act of hubris, he has learned the secret word of God, and he makes a boy out of clay, and he breathes the secret word of God into it, and it runs off and creates havoc. It creates evil. And it turns out that this is because of his act of pride. So I think of those things very much in this way, that the act of creation for me personally involves seeking into a deep well. It's like an ocean underground, forming very slowly this kind of shape, dreaming the next magician, as it were, dreaming the golem. And slowly it takes form and it becomes a set of questions, and it starts asking me to do things. It becomes sort of a guide or a challenge. And I start having to seek the sound of something which already exists in some place of imagination, but it wants to be heard now. It wants to become real. And so this is how I filter the good ideas from the bad ideas, or let's just say how I pick randomly from the ideas and I try to figure out which ones fit what the golem wants to happen, right? So this
story have different kinds of filters.
Yes, something has already come into existence in a deep place in the unconscious, and it's now driving me to ask questions. It's asking me to make a sound in a certain way or to have a certain mood. And so once that happens, I can throw things away without fear, because I know that those things that I'm throwing away don't answer the questions that I'm asking. And it can be trouble sometimes. I think if I used different methods, I would be more productive. I would probably have more than an album a year. But sometimes when it works well, I work very quickly. Right now, I'm stuck because I have an album I've been working on for over a year, and it's not finding, I have about half of it done, and the rest of it I'm stuck because the things I'm doing aren't doing what is needing. So I throw them away. I've been challenged by this. I've done other things in the meantime. I've got a new album with a wonderful Italian guitarist, Luca Formentini, and it's coming out in a few weeks. We finished it in June, and so it's now we're working on promotions and things. But so we were able to work, on a different project while I had this other solo album sitting in the back. And I need to get to that next. But you see, sometimes it's hard. Sometimes these questions don't lead to simple answers, or I'm not good enough to answer,
Yes, I think this is the creation process, and sometimes it's short and it's not quantized. It's absolutely no. It's like nature, but always the idea is the starting point, or sometimes you just messing around with sounds, and then you start to know that there is something new. This is a new work, or you have first the idea and you say, okay, I must start with the music because I have this in mind.
It goes both ways. I like to do sound design. I actually do it as a living for synthesizer companies. So one of the things that I use to get paid is for Sequential, the synth company, Dave Smith's company. I do a lot of presets for them. So whenever there's a new keyboard from Sequential, it usually has about 50 of my sounds in it. And I've done the same for other companies. Emu back in the 90s, I did a lot of samples and things for them, and other companies as well. So sometimes when I'm programming some sounds, I'll get inspired, and sometimes the sound itself will create a piece. On my album Filaments, there's two pieces that came from one sound that I did for the Pro 2 for Sequential. There's a paraphonic sound with these two parts of it, and it just had so much life. I had to give the keyboard back the next day. I only had a week to work on programming, because usually these are prototypes. It's like the first one. They might make 3 prototypes and send them out to the sound designers. And so this was one of the first 3, and I had to give it back. And so I recorded the basis for 2 pieces on Filaments using just this one patch. And so sometimes, absolutely, I'll be inspired by a sound. Sometimes I'll just, like lately, the last 10 years or so, almost every time I use the piano, it's half speed. So I have a nice 100-year-old piano that I've had in the studio for about 20 years. I bought it in 1999. And it's a 1925 AB Chase Baby Grand. Nothing major. It's not a Steinway or something. And it has a very clean, light sound. My album, Open Window, uses that piano in my old studio. And it's mostly improvised. It's really, sometimes, like I said, sometimes I'm completely improvised. On the album Open Window, I just kept a recorder and microphone set up for a month. And after dinner, I would bring a glass of wine into the studio after dinner, and I'd be very relaxed, and I would just play without thinking. I would just sit down and play and record. I would just push. I had everything on for a month and just push record and then played with nothing in my mind. And that's where the title Open Window came from, because the mind was just like an open space. It just blank. And I was able to explore certain ideas that I've had in modal music for a long time without being so critical, it's actually, Open Window probably has more of my true musical sensibility than any of my other albums. But after that, especially after my injury in 2005, I started working on much slower piano language. And the funny thing is that I have to play everything an octave higher and twice as fast. And then I slow the audio down half speed, and I get this beautiful floating kind of timbre that just suits what I'm looking for. And I think the first time I did that was probably on Nest. And Nest turned out to be a very strong album, I think, because it was, the intention was so clear on that album. And it was very much based on improvisation. And the purpose of that album was that I had been in Australia for a month, and I got back from Australia and my ears were ringing. I had tinnitus because I was playing in some of these festivals, like psytrance festivals, very, very loud. And I was using in-ear monitors, and everything was just a bit too loud. And so I still have a little bit of tinnitus, from this. And so I had these beautiful nature recordings that I had gotten in Australia, in the outback, places an hour and a half north of Sydney, and, just a beautiful, beautiful country. So the intention of Nest was basically to create music that was more silent than silence, because the ringing in my ears, I needed some noise. I needed something that would mask the tinnitus, but also create a sense of space. And so it was really one of the very few totally ambient pieces that I did that was intended to be empty of sound almost. And so the sound is just ways of creating little points of light or dots around an empty page, just a very light sketch. A slightly different approach than my sleep music with Somnium and Perpetual, where those are also completely ambient, but they're much more intensely hypnotic, drony, trance-inducing. They're They're really meant to be very low level at night, but for sort of a psychological journey, inside. So, Nest was a slightly different intention.
So all those last descriptions are about experience, not about ideas. They are about your own experience and your own needings, more physical and more
A lot of
related
it,
to the corporal experience with the presets. Also, I was thinking. I was hanging on the idea of the preset that sometimes those kind of rush that you have to bring back the keyboard, sometimes those kind of things shoot a lot of creativity, but you know that you have to there's just 2 days, and maybe you act like that. This is when we have really a really short free time and we enjoy so much this hour because we know that it's very short, and in creativity is very strange. If you have a completely free week, maybe you are not so creative that if you have, I don't know, 3 hours in a very busy week, this is amazing.
I love deadlines, and I don't have deadlines for my own music, and sometimes it takes a long time. I mean, the piece that I contributed to Cyclical Dreams uh, to Gemstones 2, I guess it was started out as an experiment with a new sequencer, Eurorack, so the 512 vector sequencer. And I just had this recording I'd made. I try to keep the recording, I try to keep the workstation open with a record button and a track enabled most of the time I'm working on things, because sometimes you just want to record stuff. It's always good to keep recording. But that just sat around on my hard disk for 5 years without an idea what to do with it, because it sounded too much like German music, And so when you guys requested a piece, I thought, I think I know the one. And so I knew I could finish it really quickly. And so I didn't spend a lot of time finishing it. It just went very fast. But yes, I think having deadlines is really good. Having to rush is good. There's something you said a minute ago, which is also true for me, which is the body and sensing intuitively that you need to feel something. And I'm very much intuitive in that way. I did an album a few years ago called Tactile Ground, which is about synesthesia. And it's very much a musical discussion of my own experience with sound, which is what I would call a tactile synesthesia. Most people, when they think of synesthesia, they think of seeing lights when they hear sound, or seeing letters and seeing colors and things like that. Usually they're looking at it in terms of vision.
Visual.
But for me, when I listen to music, it affects me on my skin, like a texture, like it's cold or wet or scratchy or abrasive. Maybe it's like sandpaper, or maybe it's like aluminum. Have you ever accidentally gotten a piece of metal in your mouth and it hits one of a metal filling in your teeth and it makes an electric shock? Or like if you're testing a battery to see if the battery's alive, like touching a 9-volt battery to your tongue. Sometimes music has that effect on you. It actually is
Nice.
like an electric shock, or sometimes not pleasant. And when, as a mastering engineer, I mean, one of the other things I do to make a living is mastering, and I do a lot of that. I am very much paying attention to my tactile synesthesia because it helps my ears to direct towards certain frequencies. I've learned from habit that if I feel things cold or scratchy, there's probably something in the high frequency range. Or if I feel like it's in my middle, it's probably, maybe there's too much low bass or too much mid range. It affects my body in different ways, and I'll feel it as if it is oily or heavy or light, or maybe something needs more weight. Perhaps a mix I feel is not heavy enough. So often I'll know which frequencies to reach for by these intuitions that are actually tactile. I feel it in my skin. And so this album, Tactile Ground, is this idea of place and displacement, which is to a certain extent another theme that I deal with a lot, which is the theme of home and travel, and the sense of what is home. What do we identify as home? Is it a house? No, it's not a house. It's something more special. We can live in a house that never feels like home our entire life, and we can always feel like something else is calling to us. Or we might have a memory of a place that we remember from our childhood, perhaps a home that our grandparents had, or something out in the forest. Maybe it's more our home than the house we live in or the apartment we live in. And so these ideas, I made a 2 CD set on Tactile Ground and called them place and displacement, the sense of location. Actually, I call them location and dislocation. And the second disc, the second half of Tactile Ground, is quite dissonant. It's actually dealing with a lot of jazz harmony and a lot of very strange microtonal dissonance, harmonic series. But it's dissonant in a way that I find very attractive. It's for me, a very beautiful kind of dissonance. I guess because I grew up with jazz, I'm really comfortable with some of these very unusual harmonies. And I think it was very strange sounding for some people. But for me, it's actually, it's a tactile music. It's music that creates a certain kind of touch, a certain kind of sensation on the skin. So it's almost like making perfumes. It's the idea is you're mixing chemistry and creating smells. And then the music is very much in the purpose of creating a sense of location and then a sense of dislocation. But part of that dislocation is because it impinges upon the body in different ways, perhaps in unusual ways. So again, it's a very intuitive idea, and it's one that is perhaps a little bit strange. I don't know.
I think it's very interesting, also inspirational to listen to you telling those things, because on the first part we are talking about very, I don't know, like more cultural or intellectual or philosophical starting points, and now we are talking about really different things. It's about feeling. It's in the end of our fingertips. So those things are creating a human being. It's like think and feel, and this sounds complete, and I think it's a very honest relationship with the music. It's a very
Music
honest.
has to
Sometimes
be.
we need to think a story or think about, I don't know, something very old from, I don't know, a mythology or something like that create a vision or create an imagination story or something. But sometimes it's about feel something abrasive.
I think more importantly, they are not mutually exclusive, is that the two things can operate together, because music is fundamentally sensation. I mean, it is something that deals directly with states of mind and moods and emotion. But my favorite emotions are the ones we don't have names for. Emotions that are sort of mysterious and maybe evade language. One that I think music can do very well that we do have a name for, I would call awe or wonder. And it's an emotion which I can feel when I read about science or philosophy. And I consider it to be a sense of beauty, an extremely moving sense of wonder is one of the most ecstatic experiences that I think we can have. A sense of smallness and a sense of the magical, exquisite existence, what it's like to be alive right now. And so by having layers of questions, by having some philosophical layers, and then more direct emotional layers, what we can do is actually enhance both sides. We can bring together intellect and emotion and not have them separate. It's not one or the other. It's actually being able to bring a sense of wonder to questions that we might find otherwise cold. So an album like Fishers, I'm sorry, not Fishers, an album like Filaments, for example, is dealing with my personal sense of wonder in cosmology and physics. So it's really about the questions of the universe and our sense of smallness, the idea of looking out into space with a radio telescope and learning that it's only 13 billion years old. And these ideas create, in my mind, a journey out into a place of smallness and a place of magical uh, wonder, of questioning. And so it's not an intellectual sensation, it's actually an emotional sensation of the bonding in the mind of ideas with beauty and that sense of beauty. And so in the end, it's a state of joy and it's a state of wonder that I'm seeking on an album like that. It's on my last solo album, Neurogenesis. It started from a dream, and it was a lucid dream that I had about a conscious cube, a painting. In fact, it was a floating cube, and there was a voice to my side explaining to me that in the brain and in the retina we have neurons that do edge detection, and that in fact what those neurons are doing is calculus. It's doing a derivative of light, because it's looking for an amplitude of curvature when it changes, when light changes its curvature between light and dark. And so it's creating shapes and creating edges and more efficiently judging the world around us, directly doing math in the neurological networks, which is true. I mean, it was in a dream I was hearing this, but in fact, I studied this when I was I studied psychology in college, at university 40 years ago, and these things are true. I mean, in the sensory cortex, in the optical cortex, we do have these edge detection cells, and they are doing calculus directly. We have cells that are doing calculus. And when I woke up from that dream, oh, by the way, when that voice was telling me, this cube was sentient. It was a thinking cube. And it started reaching filaments out towards me, like little electric fingers to reach out towards me and learn what I was in this dream. So I woke up from that dream in a state of ecstasy, in a state of fulfillment. And for about 10 minutes after that dream, I was seeing the world in pure mathematics, which is not something I typically do. I'm not a math geek. I am very intuitive in my world. But my brain was so on fire with this sensation of the beauty of observing how the brain works that I created a painting out of it. You can see it on my website. It is a cubical painting inspired by that. It hangs. It's a three-dimensional sculpture. And I made the album Neurogenesis out of it. And I wanted that album to feel like electricity in the brain. I wanted it to feel like it was plugging right into your brain and giving you that sensation like I had when I woke up from that dream. So that album is intended to be like drugs. It's electric. And so sometimes I can be inspired just by a dream. And that's happened to me before. I've had several pieces that came from dreams. And it's not just philosophy. To me, these are very visceral.
No, completely.
They're
I
experiential,
believe this is an honest approach to art. And when you work with another musicians, how it is? It's about a plan, improvisation, half and a half, because you work with very different musicians. I mean, well, you are going to to release with a guitar player, but your famous work with Steve Roach, Ian Boddy, and so on. There are different minds, different kind of approach to music. Maybe it's some very straight. I think I don't know, but maybe with Steve Roach is quite similar. I don't know, but I can imagine. a
We're very,
similar,
very different people. And actually,
very
when
different
you work
places.
with Steve, you climb onto his train. I mean, he is like a freight train, and he has steel wheels, and you strap yourself on for the ride, because he's a creative hurricane. I mean, he is a force of a voice that creates constantly. I'm not like that. So sometimes I think it's a challenge for me to work with Steve. We are very good friends. We remain close friends to this day. But collaborating with him would be a very difficult challenge for me right now. On the other hand, collaborating with Marcus Reuter is paradise, because he is so good, he is so smart and so talented that I feel like a child in school when I'm with him. I love that feeling. I love something that my friend Bob Olson, who was at Motown in the 60s, he used to say, try to make sure that you're the dumbest person in the room. I love that, because what he's saying is surround yourself with talent and you'll look good. If everybody's better than you, you're stepping up to something better. And I feel that when I'm with Marcus, I feel like I am awake and in the moment, being as good as I know how to be, challenging my sense of harmony, my sense of melody, listening extremely well, because we feel awake when we're together. Ian has a whole set of different skills. Working with Ian Body has been a joy, because we're also just good friends. I've never worked with somebody who was not a friend first. And for me, the collaboration becomes a third person. It's like a child, but really more than having a child with somebody, it's like becoming a third person, because that collaboration has a whole rhythm and psychology of its own. Every time Ian Body and I do something together, we become Robert and Ian combined. Whenever I'm with Marcus, we become Marcus and Robert combined. Likewise with Steve, it's a third person. I would say that with Luca Formentini, we became friends first. He reached out to me as a winemaker, because I also have been a winemaker, and I used to write a lot about food and wine, and it's a thing that I appreciate very much. And he lives on the shores of Lake Garda in Italy, near the Alps in northern Italy, about halfway between Firenze and Milano, in the lake country there. And he makes beautiful, clear white wines. They are very just clean and elegant. And he reached out to me about 6 years ago to see if I'd like to taste his wines as a friend and fellow winemaker and a fellow musician. He was inspired by my music as well. And so we became friends through wine first. And he came out to the United States because his winery has won awards in Italy. And this award called Tre Bicchieri sends the winemakers, like 100 winemakers around to different cities in the United States and North America to show their wines. And so he would come to San Francisco and invited me up to visit. In fact, he ended up staying at our house this was right before the pandemic. This was in January, February of 2020. And we thought, we get along well. We're friends. We can do an album together maybe, because we enjoyed each other's company, first of all. And so that friendship starts as a relationship that becomes music of a certain flavor. And the music that we came up with is a gentle, very intimate music of a place. It's an interior kind of music. And it's a music of friendship and warmth. It's actually, this album grew out of improvisation. He came in February this year. I've moved since then. We have a lovely house on the coast in Central California now. And he was the first person to see my new studio. And he stayed with us for 3 days, and we recorded very intensely for about 2.5 days, improvising together. I would play keyboard synthesizers, mostly creating some pitch centers and drones. And he would improvise some melodies and very simple, sparse chord progressions. And we stayed very sparse and repetitive with no rhythm, no click track or anything. And it led to this sound which inspired me, and I began to come up with names and titles and started editing these improvisations. And then when we went back to our homes in Italy and California, we worked in our own studios to come up with some more material. And then I edited and produced it here. But the ideas formed out of the friendship and out of the music. And it was this idea of a very quiet afternoon, just a soft place to be. And it's a very, very gentle album. And the title is For Sundays When It Rains, because it was that feeling of being inside on a quiet, beautiful day when you hear rain outside and you just don't feel like you need to be anywhere else besides where you are, and that sense of place and that sense of comfort. Um, it's a specific sensation. And so I think the album deals with this idea of nostalgia to a certain extent, memory, um, being quiet.
Yeah, nice. There, I think that we have to put in another one place that now appears the friendships, the wine, the a comfortable rainy Sunday, and that's lovely. As we see, we have many different feelings and tasted and textures and thinkings. So it's very beautiful how you put all together in a clear view, and well, I think it's very inspiring, the this approach to an honest art, as you do. And what's next? You are going to release this work, and have you some concerts or other plans, or you want to finish your own recording first and
I
say,
really want to
okay,
finish
let's
the
go
next
out?
solo album. Yeah. But I was invited to play a concert in October in Los Angeles. And I at first accepted, but I've decided to wait until maybe early 2023. It's a very good organizer called Ambient Church, and I did one of their concerts in 2018 in New York, in Brooklyn, and it was really good. I was extremely happy with the organization and with the audience. Um, I'm still a little bit nervous about the pandemic. There's still waves of new variations happening, and people are still getting sick around here. It's exhausting. I'm just tired. And my wife and I think we've decided that we are a little too good at being hermits. It's something that came to us very naturally. So when everybody went and hid in 2020, I think we actually, I feel a bit guilty saying this. It's like I shouldn't admit this, but we felt quite comfortable hiding. Um, it was natural for us. And that was a
I
lesson.
heard this of many artists as well.
I'm an introvert. I can take care of, I can keep myself occupied for days and days and days in a row.
Centuries.
So I actually, started working. I came out with 2 albums in 2020. And then in 2021, I slowed way down. And in fact, there's a reason for that partially is that we were house hunting. We wanted to move to get away from the city, also because of this question of being a hermit. I think we needed to move out to the country and somewhere quieter. But that's over now, and we can start slowly unfolding. I think, like origami, slowly taking the piece of paper and unfolding it into an open thing again. But it's going to take me time. And I think for me, I haven't performed live in 3 years, and I'm a little slow, a little rusty. So I need to get back my skills at doing that. But maybe I'm also feeling a little old and losing some energy. So I'm not sure. I need to think about that. Um,
Well, just
but
taking your organic time.
yeah, I mean, I was already feeling like the concerts had become out of my control a little bit. My last two concerts in 2019 were really large, and I had to fly to them across the world. So one was in Poland. It was an all-night concert for the 30th anniversary of Solidarity. It was the 30th anniversary of their constitution. So it was like Independence Day for them. And a very prestigious concert. I played all night in the Solidarity Center in Gdansk, where Lech Wales's office is still. And it was the first time they had the Solidarity Center open all night long for the public. And this was a great honor for me. It was a huge thing. And so that was in August. And then in November, I played to the largest audience I've ever played, which was in Hanoi, Vietnam, for 15,000 people at a festival. And usually I play for 100 people. I usually play very small concerts. Or smaller, sleep concerts are usually for 50 or less. And I felt like that was too much for me. I felt like it was a very distant experience. I was on this big stage with a big, light screen behind me doing light show stuff. And the audience was 20 meters in front of me, very distant. I couldn't really see any faces in the dark. And it was an outdoor concert at night. So it went way into the distance, this big 3-day festival. And I wondered if really that's what I'm here for. I don't think that was a victory for me. It was a great experience, and they were excellent. And I felt very proud to be there. But sometimes I feel like my best concerts are very intimate and with 20 people in a house, house concert. Sometimes those are the ones where I have the most fun. And I have to think about that a little bit. I have to just decide if this idea of getting bigger and bigger is for me. It's really not for me. It's not the way I think. And I think maybe I need to get smaller and smaller and fold myself up inside of my little shell for a little bit longer, perhaps. But the next thing in the future might be some more concerts again, maybe, if I can figure out a new way to do it. But my next album, I have a title, I have an idea, but I'm stuck. The working title is Traveler's Cloth, and it's about change, and it's about life and transitioning through getting older also. But it's also how we wear our body, but yet we are our body. We are not different from it. We are in a very changing, disposable thing. And these ideas, I think I'm very inspired by translations of some Taoist literature from 1,000 years ago in China. A particular translator into English named Hinton is his last name, who inspired me a lot. And these ideas in Taoism of the fabric of sensation, the way that our perceptions of the world that we're in are sort of a woven energy. I can't discuss it in words because it's really more of an insight. It's a spiritual concept, I suppose. But I want this album to be very, very ecstatic and very much about, the way the music can work energy. And so I haven't found the right energy. I have about half of it, but I'm struggling with the rest of it. So that's been the next project, which I keep setting aside because I'm not finding my skills. I haven't been good enough, basically.
Maybe it's just a question of time. All the things have its own time to grow enough. That's very beautiful, very honest. Once again, very honest. Once again, with it's what we truly expect for an artist, for a true artist, that have an honest relationship with their own art, and this is beautiful and again inspiring. So
Thank you.
thank you so much, Robert. Thank you so much for all those beautiful minutes, almost an hour of an incredible um, sincere, authentic confession about being an artist in this world, in this time. Thank you so much in the name of Cyclical Dreams and personally too. And keep on. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much. It's an honor to have a conversation with you.